Well, after an introduction such as that, ladies and gentlemen, let me reciprocate by saying that it's a great pleasure for a Scottish First Minister to speak at this, the most influential and magnificent university in these United States. There is a story about Harold Wilson, who was a Prime Minister, Labour Prime Minister in the 1960s. And he was making a speech in the 1966 election campaign in Devonport, which is a huge naval base in the south of England. And he started his speech by saying, "Ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure to speak to you here at the home of the Premier Service. And why do I say that the Royal Navy is the Premier Service?" And somebody shouted out, "Because you're in Devonport." It's a great pleasure for me as First Minister to speak at the most influential and prestigious university in these United States. Seriously, ladies and gentlemen, I've had the most wonderful... Jennifer Erickson, who is on my staff, and actually Jennifer works for a range of clients, but she does pro bono work for the Scottish Government from time to time. But she's told me that of the wonders of this university founded by Thomas Jefferson, and in my short visit this morning I was able to see much of what she said was not an exaggeration. I've got this theory about things where you go into a factory or a government or an office or a local authority or any organisation that I've been involved in, you can tell almost immediately whether it's a good place or a bad place, whether it's well run or badly run, whether it's got problems or whether it's got triumphs and achievements, or a mixture of both for that matter. And I can tell you that from what I've seen and understood today, this is a university in really good hands, with a tremendous atmosphere in its staff and its students, and its mission is well secured. So it is indeed an honour to speak at this Thomas Jefferson's University. So I'd like to thank the university, and particularly to Dr. Garston and Sandy Gillam, for their kind invitation. They are examples of these fabled Virginia gentlemen, and I've been delighted to meet them both. I'd also like to welcome Bill Lighty, an excellent servant of Virginia, and indeed a friend and advisor of the Scottish Government. So I'm here in the United States to celebrate what is actually the first ever Scotland Week. We've had Tartan Weeks before, and Tartan Weeks have been around Tartan Day, which is on April 6th, which is the anniversary of a document, the sealing of which I'm going to come to in a few seconds, called the Declaration of Arbroath. And 10 years ago, the Senate passed a resolution designating April the 6th as Tartan Day, and a variety of events sprung up around it called Tartan Week. But this year we're having a Scotland Week and a Tartan Day, because we found from our inquiries that people didn't necessarily automatically connect Tartan with Scotland. Now, I can see there's one or two people here do. There's a McInnes down at the front with a marvellous plaid on, ladies and gentlemen, but just to make sure people do. And so we're having a range of events and discussions and speeches and business meetings and cultural events, and we're climaxing in a massive parade down 6th Avenue next Saturday in New York. So if 2 or 3 of you can abscond from your studies for a day or so, it'd be well worth coming to on Saturday, and we're having a fantastic time. Because celebrating Scotland and Scottish connections with the United States is something which is very well worth doing. Indeed, there will be a very special opportunity next year for people to celebrate the Scottish connections, because next year is the 250th anniversary of the birthday of Robert Burns, Scotland's national poet, one of the most famous celebrated poets in the history of humankind. Next year is the year of the homecoming. So I'm putting out a call. Actually, I'm putting out an instruction to 80 million Scots across the planet. Get back to Scotland next year, celebrate the birthday of Robert Burns and the homecoming. And I hope many of you are able to take the opportunity to come and be with us in what will be a very special year. But the other anniversary we're celebrating, the 10th anniversary of the designation of Tartan Day, I think is something worth taking note of, because it's an event and it's a day that honours the shared connections between Scotland and the United States. And in marking Tartan Day back 10 years ago in 1998, the Senate recognised that this medieval document, the Declaration of Arbroath, sealed, because you didn't sign things in 1320, you sealed them, but sealed on the 6th of April 1320 was a very important document in history, and a document which has a resonance and an importance for the foundation of the United States. And so therefore, in talking about that thing, which is what I'm going to talk about today, and I'm going to talk about particular aspects of Thomas Jefferson which can provide an insight and enlightenment and an inspiration to our thinking. The Jefferson ability to articulate the principles of liberty, of sovereignty of the individual, the equality of mankind, the strength of executive power that helped define a new era in governance, I think it's highly important to reflect on what connection there might be in all of that with a Scottish delegation of Scottish document of some centuries earlier. So just before I flew out to America at the weekend, I had the opportunity to see the Declaration of Arbroath, see the original, as it were. It's not actually the original. The original was sent to Pope John the 22nd. We kept a file copy. And when I was visiting Monticello this morning, I noticed that Thomas Jefferson had a polygraph, which is not a lie detector in these days, in Jefferson's days, but it was a way of copying documents in his desk. So you could take one copy and it automatically copied another copy of the document. I've no idea if the barons and the nobles in 1320 had the same device. I suspect they probably didn't. But nonetheless, there was a file copy taken and sealed, and that is the one that we still have in Scotland. Obviously, it's a document which is almost 700 years old, and therefore is in extremely fragile condition, but it exists in a special container, of oxygen-starved container, which was actually designed in the United States, not at this university, but one of these red brick places that you've got, designed for us and built in Edinburgh, and there in this sealed container is the Declaration of Arbroath. Luckily, a Lizard, who in 1815 was engaged to make a plate of the Declaration. I say luckily because there was some damage, some water damage to the Declaration in the late 19th century. So luckily enough, there was a plate made by Lizard in 1815, and a very early lithograph in the 19th century done of that, which does the complete document. And I've actually brought one along with me, of which there are 100 copies in existence, and now one, at the end of this speech, will be placed here in the University of Virginia. So, ladies and gentlemen, the Declaration of Arbroath. Of which I'll say slightly more later. Now, I speak to you today as head of the Scottish Government. However, the nation of Scotland, for the time being at least, is a member of the United Kingdom, rather than a fully independent country. Now, as Mr. Jefferson himself might have expected, I'm going to focus today on the vital questions of the fundamental rights of nations and peoples across this speech. And here in the splendid Dome Room, I want to stimulate discussion of the special links between Scotland and America. I want to discuss the intellectual legacy of Thomas Jefferson, the relevance of his ideas to modern Scotland, and finally to discuss Scotland's place in the world and the extent of the desire in our nation, in the best Jeffersonian tradition, to take full responsibility for our destiny and to join the community of nations in the 21st century. So firstly, let's look at these deep ties between Scotland and the United States, the bonds of culture, of family. They are strong and they are extremely deep. It's an exchange of ideas, of people, of values, of technology. It is a strong partnership. And although Scotland is a small nation and America is a large one, it is a partnership and always has been of equals. Woodrow Wilson, as president, said famously that every line of strength in American history is a line coloured with Scottish blood. And more recently, the esteemed senator from this state, Virginia, Jim Webb, has written a superb book on this very subject. He called it Born Fighting, how the Scots-Irish shaped America. I have to say, Jim, in his book, tends to feature on the fighting bit quite a bit, as you would expect from somebody of his background, but there are other connections in culture and democracy and ideas and scientific advance and enlightenment as well, which are also featured in his book. And I agree with Senator Webb when he says that Scotland's contribution to the United States has always been more about the power of ideas and values and the drive to improve society. And it's not depended on just the weight of numbers. A couple of years back, I was on a previous lecture tour of the United States. I was told by a member of the audience at my very first lecture that there were 4 million Scots Americans. And in the very last lecture I gave, I was told that there was more than 20 million Scots Americans. A remarkable rise in the Scots American population over the space of a week, which was the length of the lecture tour. So I did some investigation, given the uncertainty, and I found out, and in fact Jim Webb cites this in his book, that there are, according to surveys, 27 million Americans claim Scots-Irish or Scottish ancestry. However, the census data, the official data, indicates around 10 million people in this country actually have Scottish traced descent. Can I say, ladies and gentlemen, this is the most wonderful compliment to our country. There are, across these United States, 17 million people who think they're Scottish, who want to be Scottish, who tell folk they're Scottish, but the census data indicates that they might not be stretching back 2 or 3 generations. Can I say today, and let's call this the Declaration of Virginia, you're in. Because I want to expand this association with Scotland and Scottishness to the maximum degree. Our Celtic cousins in Ireland did something of the same a few years ago. I think it was a marvellous success, and we're certainly going to replicate that attitude, because this is a major part of the influence that Scotland wants to have in benign terms, of course, but across the planet, is to mobilise those who feel friendship and affection and affinity with our country. And hopefully, with that, we can do some good for humankind. So, the bonds between us are enduring and they're positive. The Scottish contribution to America in business and government and philanthropy and culture explains part of this resonance. Of course, if we look at business, then many of the foremost figures in business, you would expect us, being a Scot, this is not a great surprise. On many routes, Andrew Carnegie, of course, John D. Rockefeller, I understand they were modestly successful when they came to the United States. John Paul Getty, whose ancestors fled Scotland after the Battle of Culloden in 1746, a distinction, incidentally, which he held in common with Elvis Presley, who wasn't really in business, but nonetheless, I thought I'd get a mention of the King's name just when I was here. For a contemporary example, we can look at Bill Gates, a proud Scot on his mother's side. And these individuals, and Senator Webb's book, incidentally, cites many, many, many more, helped shape the modern United States economy, building industrial giants have provided jobs and wealth across America. And many of these individuals were also guided by a higher purpose, one which Jefferson would have profoundly approved, philanthropy and the welfare of future generations. It was Andrew Carnegie himself who said, "The man who dies rich dies disgraced." On that basis, I'm in no immediate danger of dying disgraced, but nonetheless, to pick up just one aspect of this, Carnegie's legacy was to provide 1,700 public libraries across the United States, and indeed another 800 across the globe. So that takes us into another theme, and also a theme that would have been beloved by Jefferson, obviously, speaking here at this university, and one which has always been at the heart of the Scottish spirit, the theme of civic education. We passed, when I was at school, I was often told that Scots invented. I didn't get a great deal of Scottish history. They tended to think it was a wee bit dangerous, actually, but nonetheless, I didn't get taught much Scottish history. We're changing that. We're teaching a lot now. I was taught that Scots had invented lots of stuff. Things like penicillin, the television, the fax machine. and right through. And I was never actually taught why we invented all these things. In fact, J.K. Galbraith once said, and I paraphrase him, but this is roughly accurate, he said that in the history of humankind, only two nations had invented anything worth a damn, that was the Scots and the Jews. Everybody else had invented things of no great importance. Now, I have to say, J.K. Galbraith, John Kenneth Galbraith, was a Scots-Canadian, so he wasn't entirely impartial in these matters, but nonetheless, there was something in what he said. But I was never taught why Scotland invented all these things. There was some indication that we should be proud and reflect the fact that we'd contributed so much in terms of scientific and advance and enlightenment and indeed medical advance, but never quite why we'd done it. And of course, the reason we did it, and the reason we were able to do it, is the most important Scottish invention of all, and that was free, universal education. And in 1696, in fact, the first Scottish Education Act was 1496, but in 1696, the old Scots Parliament, not the one we have now, but the one before the Treaty of Union, prescribed for education in every parish. And Scotland was able, in succeeding centuries, to mobilise that human capital, that democratic intellect, because we educated more of our population than any other society on earth. We were good at inventing things for the same reason that the Welsh were once good at rugby football, because every child in Wales, off a time, played rugby. And when every child in Wales played rugby, by and large, they had a good rugby team. Scotland invented things because every child in Scotland had the opportunity. It was an interesting contrast, incidentally, with that was the first public legislation in Scotland, was universal free education at parish level. In England, the first public legislation was the Poor Law, leading, I suppose, to the argument that in England, you weren't allowed to starve. You could go to the poorhouse, but you weren't allowed to be educated. Whereas in Scotland, you were allowed to starve, but you would be educated under all circumstances. An interesting example of how societies make different choices. The assumption was if you were educated, then you had a chance of avoiding starvation. In England, I suspect that they found education a bit dangerous as well. A genuine civic education to enhance the mind, the values, and the spirit of all our citizens. And of course, Jefferson himself shared exactly that view and the power of education, which is why he created this wonderful university. The first in America, of course, to separate religious doctrine from teaching, but still an institution where ethics are fundamental. And Jefferson, of course, received what could be described as a traditional Scottish education. He was taught first by the Reverend William Douglas, a man of whom it was said, "Curse Thomas Jefferson, who became Minister of France for 5 years after the Revolution, to a lifetime of speaking French, impeccable French, with a pronounced Scottish accent." That was down to the Reverend William Douglas, so it's said. And at 17, Jefferson began his studies at the College of William and Mary, which was founded by James Blair, where he was taught mathematics and philosophy by William Small, a Scots emigre, son of a Presbyterian minister. And Jefferson, throughout his life, credited Small as one of his major intellectual influences. And let me consider a final important linkage between Scotland and America, another crucial channel of influence: politics. The noblest profession of all, even if its practitioners rate in public esteem marginally above real estate agents and journalists, of course. Everybody rates above journalists. Scots and Scots-Irish have sustained a remarkable level of presence at every level in the United States government throughout the history of the Republic. In Jim Webb's book, he puts the number of Scots-Irish presidents at 12, and indeed I can tell you if either Senator Obama or Senator McCain succeeds in winning the presidency, that figure will move to a lucky 13. Because both gentlemen's ancestry has been reliably traced back, apparently, to the 12th century Scottish king, William the Lion. Not to be confused with William the Conqueror. William the Lion started off quite well, but unfortunately then got captured in England, so he's William the Unconqueror. He was William the Lion. He was very brave, a wee bit foolhardy, But nonetheless, both Senator Obama and Senator McCain apparently can claim ancestry back to William the Lion. I have to say, I was highly impressed by this fact when it appeared in some of the Scottish press. It was only slightly tempered by a genealogist who came on and said, yeah, but so could 60 million other people. But nevertheless, I think we shall let the claim rest where it does. And I don't think your country could be in safer hands, because from the very foundation of your republic, indeed of those who signed the Declaration of Independence, at least 1/3, and some people have argued up to 3/4, were of Scots descent. And since then, there's been a Scot sitting in the Oval Office, if not for all of the time, then for a great deal of the time. Now, I'm going on to talk in a minute or two about the ideas of Thomas Jefferson that echoes back to Scotland. But let me first summarise the argument. I've said today the United States has many millions of people of Scots ancestry. And I've also argued that for all of the numbers, the impact of Scots on America, on your society, on your economy, on your politics and your culture has been greater still. In a very real sense, the values which are the very core of the Scottish nation and which Scottish migrants helped bring to these shores have helped to provide the founding values of this democracy. The rights of the individual, and particularly of the common man, the primacy of education, the transformational power of enterprise, and an unswerving commitment to civic duty. These are core Scottish values. They help shape the character of the American Revolution and indeed the character of this nation. Now, obviously, and let me be clear, these values did not by themselves make America or define America. They didn't provide America with the unifying philosophy, a permanent means of building and organising a free and fair society. And it's in that respect that the alchemist Thomas Jefferson and his peers, Washington, Franklin, Madison, and many others, they are the fathers, obviously, of the United States. And as I could reflect that these men came in an age just after the Scottish Parliament had capitulated into an incorporating union with London, and these people instead had the courage to challenge autocratic rule, to assert the basic rights of America and its peoples through the Declaration of Independence, to codify these rights with clarity and power in the Constitution of the United States. And then, just as important, subsequently to govern and act in respect and reverence of these founding principles, according individual liberty paramount importance, not only in legal documents, but in the conduct of everyday life. Now, Scotland as Scots, we also live in a free and open society, and one where individuals have clear rights and clear responsibilities. But Scotland as a country, as a nation, has yet to resolve what collective decision we want to make about our own constitutional status. Where you chose independence, we have yet to follow. But if we do follow your lead, and I have no doubt that we can, indeed I have no doubt that we will, I want to submit today in that historic journey, we would have no better guide than Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson and all the founding fathers were aware that in creating an American democracy, they were also elaborating basic and enduring principles to guide all nations at all times. It was a universal doctrine. And the ideas and principles of democracy that are global, both in their power and in their application. And they resonate with people in Scotland as much as they do with established and aspiring democracies across the planet. Lincoln said that the principles of Jefferson are the axioms of a free society. So let me focus on three of these founding principles. The first one, and this is the one from which all else follows, is that the people are sovereign. Or as Jefferson put it, it is the people to whom authority belongs. This is a maxim that American citizens are familiar with. Perhaps in the way of all familiarity, sometimes you take it for granted. It is indeed a principle which many peoples, including those of the United Kingdom, would find easily understandable. But the test of the principle is in the willingness to engage in the full implications of putting it into practice. It's the people who are sovereign which is the true test of our commitment to democratic understanding. And for example, it's a test that today some people in the United Kingdom would find it difficult to pass. There are people, supporters of the present Union in Scotland and elsewhere, who are unwilling to even consider the question of Scottish independence. And most extraordinary of all, there are politicians who consider it is they, and not the people of Scotland, who should arbitrate and determine the nature of further constitutional change in Scotland. I don't think it would take very long to understand and evaluate what Thomas Jefferson would have made of that state of affairs. Because even the briefest consideration of the second founding principle, on which I'll draw, puts the answer very plainly. Jefferson wrote that every nation has a right to govern itself internally under what forms it pleases and to change these forms at its own will. That's the basis on which the United States first asserted its right to self-government. It remains one of your founding fundamental principles. It's a guiding principle for the debate, incidentally, on Scotland's future, a national conversation involving all of the people and communities of Scotland. Thus, when the people of Scotland consider their place in the world and debate our own constitutional future, the proper means to exercise that sovereignty is through a referendum. The vast majority of people in Scotland wish a referendum. That indeed is the right of the people to determine through that exercise of sovereign power. Now, my wish, unsurprisingly, is to see an independent Scotland. Other people, quite legitimately, disagree with that ambition. Now, I respect that divergence. That's the very stuff of politics. If you didn't have arguments and differences, then you wouldn't have debate. If you didn't have debate, then of course you wouldn't have democracy. That is the very, very stuff of politics. But what I demand, and what we have the right to demand, is when the decision is made, when the matter comes through debate to decision, that cannot be made by politicians alone. It must be made by the people in a referendum. It must be made by the sovereignly expressed decision of the people. I don't think there's any doubt in what side of that particular argument Thomas Jefferson would have supported. For Jefferson enshrined a third constitutional principle. He demanded that, having settled on a constitution, the people of a nation remain free for all time to amend it, to change it, according to their will. It's a permanent right, irrespective of whether a nation's circumstances, internal or external, change. Sovereignty is not lost. Sovereignty can be engaged with, sovereignty can be subject to agreement, but sovereignty is never lost. It remains with the people, and if they so wish, they can change their circumstances and arrangement at any time of their choosing. And in Scotland, as we consider our own nation's future, we must consider two profound changes in the nature and utility of political independence, not just in our own nation, but globally. The first of these changes has been recently discussed by Professor Tom Nairn. Indeed, it's a theme which has been taken up by many others, who see the emergence of what they describe as a New Deal at the heart of globalisation. I argued yesterday in a lecture at Harvard University that the first half of the last century, and perhaps later, smaller independent nations faced two major challenges in terms of their economies. First was guaranteeing their security, and secondly, gaining access to wider markets. However, since then, a new, open, and more benign international environment has emerged. We face difficulties and uncertainties across the planet, but the difficulties we face, the uncertainties are there, are through international terrorism, which affects nations large and small. They're not, by and large, through territorial acquisition of large nations on small nations. The world marketplace is, by and large, more open than it's ever been at any time in world history. And the world prosperity that is guaranteed by that openness is a factor of recent decades. That fundamentally changes the utility of independence within a global world. It's a positive environment. The disadvantages of small nations have effectively disappeared, and therefore they're now exercising their natural strengths. flexibility, speed of decision-making, defined national interests allowing a clear economic strategy. In short, the implicit rules of the global system have changed. In this new era, small independent nations will thrive. And the second profound change which affects the meaning of independence is the pooling of sovereignty at international level. If we take the European Union as a positive example, it's one that's permanently changed the nature and arguments for Scottish membership of the United Kingdom. Indeed, it's fatally weakened the pro-union case. An independent Scotland would remain a committed member of the European Union and would be active and positive at other levels of governance, not least in the United Nations. Because while each of these bodies requires the sharing of sovereignty, there are large and visible benefits to collective international action. Among the nations of the British Islands, whether the members of the Union or independent as the Republic of Ireland is at the present moment, there will always be friendship, respect, trust and partnership. For example, we have currently a British-Irish Council. It brings together all of the heads of government throughout the British Isles. It provides an excellent forum for cross-border partnerships. And when we met in Dublin earlier this year, we agreed to extend cooperation on several issues of shared concern, including justice, energy, and indeed climate change. Now, I know that this close and constructive partnership, which unites all the nations of these islands, would provide the basis for sustained cooperation and achievement. But if you take these examples together, what they show is the nature and meaning of political independence has changed. They show that today, although the sovereignty of each nation has only one home, it has many houses. That the place of Scotland, like any independent nation, is in changing the modern world. And it's time for the people of Scotland to consider our nation's future and our potential to create the constitution that we need to achieve and realise that potential. So thus far, ladies and gentlemen, I've proposed three of the most important lessons for Scotland in terms of the principle and content of the work of Thomas Jefferson. But there are also vital lessons for Scotland in the manner and the conduct of Jefferson's politics. How to think about political issues, how to conduct debate, how to defend the rights of a nation. Jefferson was patient, honest, thoughtful. For a politician, he was personally shy and, by all accounts, no great orator. As president, he even suspended the tradition of the spoken State of the Union address, an innovation, incidentally, which might have been worthy of repetition by some presidencies over the last 2 centuries. But in debate and discussion, over years, indeed over 4 decades of active practicing politics, Jefferson was both fearless and tireless. He spoke the truth to power, just as plainly to George III as to his political rivals. Jefferson was relentless in the pursuit of democratic principles. He was unabashed in his ambition for the United States of America and all of its peoples. Now, we in Scotland, our politicians, our people, can legitimately draw inspiration from the conduct of Jefferson. Because a people that is reflected on his principles, is consistent in its aims, is resolute in its principles, can be an irresistible force. A people that comes together as a nation, not based on where we were born, but on the values and ambitions that we share, can be a force for good and a force for right, not just in our own nation, but across the world. And my government's committed to building that independent Scotland. We believe the moral and practical case is overwhelming. But today, within the present constitutional arrangements, we will do our utmost to improve the lives of people in Scotland. And we know that tomorrow, with full responsibility for our own destiny, Scotland can make an even better nation. Our people can become more free, more prosperous, and indeed more secure. That is our vision. It's not too different from the vision of Thomas Jefferson when he showed America the route and way to independence. Declaration of Independence, and I was able to see a facsimile of it today in this university. It was steeped in the principles of the Enlightenment, an intellectual revolution that Scots did a great deal to shape. Some scholars, as I referred to earlier, back up the view that Jefferson, indeed other founders of the Republic, themselves drew a much earlier inspiration from the Declaration of Arbroath, which encapsulates the resolve not just of the nobles and barons of Scotland, but from an entity, a thought, that really for the first time in European history crept into the Arbroath Declaration. The Arbroath Declaration speaks about the community of the realm of Scotland. Now, the interesting thing is, what was this community of the realm? It's not specified in the document. The document talks about the nobles. It lists the people who seal the document. It talks about barons and freeholders, and then it says, and the whole community of the realm. In other words, something beyond the feudal superstructure, resonating on something which went beyond the accepted norms of 14th century Europe. The argument is, and I think it's a strong one, that in that phrase, in that reference, there is the encapsulation of a principle that a nation goes beyond title and land and feudal contract, but resonates to something wider and something more important. The Declaration goes on in terms which wouldn't be unfamiliar to those of you who, and I know you all will, know the Declaration of Independence, to cite all of the dreadful things that Edward I had done to Scotland, in the same way as the Declaration of Independence cites all the dreadful things that George III had done to America. But then, instead of just saying, well, that's absolutely typical of these folk, it actually says something quite different, and both the Declaration of Arbroath and the Declaration of Independence go on a surprising path. The Declaration of Arbroath says, after listing all of these dreadful things that have been done to Scotland, says about the Pope, he calls him God's vice-regent on earth, and said there is a neither weighing or distinction of Jew and Greek, Scotsman or Englishman. Something about all men created equal in the sight of God is exactly what the Declaration of Arbroath maintains. Quite surprising when you think of the litany of complaints that the Declaration has just cited against the perfidy of Edward I, just as the Declaration of Independence cites, after listing the iniquities of George III, that all men are created equal and have certain rights and liberties attached to them regardless of background or circumstance. But the third aspect of the Declaration of Arbroath, which is of particular interest to what happened much later, is what it then says about what Scots should do. It obviously spends a good deal of time saying that Robert the Bruce is a great guy. He's absolutely fantastic. He's led the Scots to a series of victories over this force which had come upon them, and therefore he is king and legitimate king by right of conquest, by right of performance. And then it goes on to this extraordinary paragraph which says, "Yet if he should give up what is begun, and agree to make us or our kingdom subject to the King of England or the English, we should exert ourselves at once to drive him out as our enemy and a subverter of his own rights and ours, and make some other man who is well able to defend us our king. For as long as 100 of us remain alive, never we shall in any condition be brought under English rule. It is not for truth, not for glory, nor riches, nor honours that we are fighting, but for freedom, for that alone, which no honest man gives up, but with life itself." Now, apart from the ringing, wonderful language, at the heart of that paragraph is probably the first expression in European history of a contractual right between government and governed. In other words, that the king may be a great guy, he may have established himself by force of arms, but if he was to subvert the rights of the country, then he would be removed and somebody else would be brought in to take his place. The contractual right between government and governed, the sovereignty of the people, the right of decision, exactly the principle which was encapsulated so wonderfully some 4.5 centuries later in the Declaration of Independence. I have to confess, ladies and gentlemen, some 8 years ago, when I first paid some attention to this concept of the Arbroath Declaration being an influence on American thought in the Revolutionary Wars, I tended to, if not pooh-pooh it, I tended to not think it was of any great substance. And I spoke to a professor of history at Glasgow University, who I rate very heavily, called Professor Ted Cowan, and I said, you know this stuff that some American historians have come up with and the Senate has passed, what do you think about it? And Ted said, no, I said, I don't think there's too much to it. About 2 years later, I met Professor Cowan, who I should say is an extremely distinguished professor of history, in a bar in San Francisco. And he shouted me across. He was there lecturing on the links between the Declaration of Arbroath and the Declaration of Independence. He shouted me across and said, you see that argument you put to me? I've been looking at it, it's really strong, and we're uncovering lots of evidence of the various people at the various meetings and the congressional meetings and the rest of it who would seem to have a considerable working knowledge of the Declaration of Arbroath. Whether or not that was the case, whether or not it was a direct influence, or whether it was a percussion influence, the idea that centuries before people had legitimized a fight against oppression, a fight for liberty, by calling into being a concept that transcended their own circumstances but was actually equally valid to all humankind, I'm not certain it matters all that much. I like to believe it is exactly the case, and probably increasingly I do. But what is absolutely certain is that the arguments, the principles that were encapsulated in the Arbroath Declaration are exactly the principles which were superbly enunciated by Thomas Jefferson in your Declaration of Independence. And the key point about it is the principles that apply not just to our nation or to this nation, but to all nations, all humankind. And that was the essential genius which is partly reflected in the Arbroath Declaration and certainly reflected in the work of Thomas Jefferson. And with clarity and with force. Now, having either directly or by an echo translated that sort of concept into American life and American understanding, I'm rather hopeful that the echo will reflect back again to Scotland, because the purpose of this speech today is to say that the expression of these wonderful ideas, so magnificently deployed by that greatest of Americans, is exactly the inspiration that we in Scotland should take, not just in terms of the destination and objective and the route on which we are travelled, but the manner and the way in which we seek to achieve that objective. It is therefore to Thomas Jefferson that we can legitimately look for guidance both on the principles and the conduct of our national debate. And it is the words of Jefferson that will inspire us both today and the years ahead. We are a people capable of self-government and worthy of it. Thank you very much.